Hi everyone, Jacob here from Good UI, and in this little presentation I wanted to re-record and represent a talk I gave to Zoho this week, and the topic is running big experiments first, so that you get more out of your A/B tests. Okay, so I'm going to start off with essentially what's at core to Good UI and what I'm doing with these experiments is basically I have a belief that A/B tests shouldn't be discarded, shouldn't be thrown away, that they have value, and that they should be recycled, reused to predict, prioritize, and design future experiments. Okay, and obviously some of you have seen some of the kind of work, and basically that implies that I'm looking for all sorts of A/B tests and experiments from various companies, including something here shared by Ronnie from Microsoft, from Skype, where, for example, they tested icon labels. So these little labels here in the Skype app, which had some sort of effect. Okay, and of course, there's other experiments similar like that shared by other companies, by other people here. So, for example, Pep from CXL, his agency ran this test, which they shared as well. This little icon experiment here with some sort of measurable impact. Okay, and that's when obviously at the core to Good UI, this is where things get interesting because these similar experiments can be compared. Okay, so compared under patterns. Patterns are kind of a vehicle, a grouping of similar experiments. And the reason we're doing this is to get a sense of likelihood that this is also going to work or it won't work in the future based on the degree of reproducibility or repeatability. And these, of course, all these numbers come from multiple experiments. The more winning, losing, and significant results we can kind of combine together, hopefully the more accurate this picture will become, as well as the impact, the predicted impact, which obviously is gold for prioritizing experiments. Okay, so that's obviously the introduction to what's happening at background to Good UI. To those that don't know, and of course now I just wanted to talk about is the core is the idea of running smaller, little or bigger experiments. And as a kind of quick intro, what I mean by that, little experiments are typically kind of single change, one variable experiments with one particular change or one or two changes or something like that, in that spectrum, in that direction. Okay, and larger, bigger experiments, I mean a variant which holds multiple changes, potentially maybe even across multiple screens. I think there's a tendency to go with little experiments, controlled experiments first when we plan whatever we want to optimize. And I think some of the kind of explanations or maybe reasons why this is so is it's a kind of a classic A/B test setup, a classic randomized control trial, so to say. And that helps us get a little bit closer at the cause and effect of a single little change. Okay, by isolating for that, we of course can determine whether that has an effect or not. I think typically these experiments, not always, they often have a lower effort or are easier to set up because they require maybe less work, although there are exceptions. And I think big companies also tend to do these. Maybe we get inspired by larger companies as well. Now the question remains, okay, and what's the approximate impact of smaller versus larger experiments? And this week, I looked over a bunch of experiments, 263 experiments, to try and answer that question. Okay, so on the left here, essentially right now we have a pool of 231 experiments on Good UI, and those are typically smaller changes. Sorry, they're usually the smaller experiments, and they come from a range of companies. These are winning, losing, and significant and flat experiments from Good UI. And when we look at the median impact from all these results, this is the kind of number we got. Comparing that to these larger leap experiments. So this is from 5 years worth of larger projects where we did exactly this. So larger, multiple changes in one variant. And when we looked at the approximate kind of impact, relative effect from these 32 projects, we found that the impact was way higher, 19%. Okay, so this is our first signal indication that larger experiments have larger potential. Of course, size or impact is very much closely tied to sample size, the required sample size for an A/B test, as well as the duration of the experiment, right? So if you look at the Evans Miller's sample size calculator, which is one of the first ones from, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that, it's probably the most linked sample size calculator. When we enter the 3.8 approximate effect from smaller experiments, the recommended sample size for something like that is 207,000. That's a lot of visitors, times 2, by the way, because this is per variant, right? So that's more or less what's needed to detect that kind of small effect. Comparatively, if we look at the kind of higher 90% relative gain, the sample size is way, way, way smaller, only at 8,500 visitors per variant. Okay. If we put that into perspective, into the big picture of lining up 5 consecutive small 3.8 experiments, this is kind of to scale, and this shows as the comparatively, like, that this is a long time. This is a lot of visitors that are needed to kind of detect, to run these 5 kind of small experiments versus that one smaller sample experiment that reaches for 90%. By the way, a little caveat here, this isn't adjusted for compounding, so this duration here is actually not 90%, but like 20 and a half or so. Anyhow, this is still gives you a sense of how much more traffic you need to burn through with your experimentation to run these 5 experiments versus the single larger one. Of course, if this signal has some merit, then this would be a sign or evidence in favor of that. Like, big experiments are a perfect way of decreasing the testing duration, your time, for how much time you need to run an experiment. And this is also indicative of increasing impact. And of course, this ties in very nicely for smaller companies that don't have much traffic and have a lot more of an upside with a lot more issues that could be potentially optimized upfront. So let's go big. Big experiments. Aside of sharing test data with companies that share real, trustworthy, awesome experiments and sample size, conversion rates, and relative effects, real experiments, we also look at a handful of companies that we know are actively running experiments. They often have velocities of hundreds or even thousands of experiments per month. These are companies like Amazon, Google, Netflix, Booking, Airbnb, and such. Okay, so we look at, from the public point of view, what they're testing. And this is one such example. Amazon this year, sometime in September, ran this experiment with this variation here. And notice that there's quite a bit of changes here. And we know this because we have this method of clearing cookies and basically seeing whether there is an active experiment. So that's how we know what's being tested. Okay, and again, in this B variant here, there's a couple of different changes that would either sometimes A would appear and sometimes B would appear, and so there's one of these changes is like a repositioning of the product image, making it larger, shifting of the buttons, shifting of description, smaller number set of product tiles. I think this is 7 versus 8 here. And fast forward another 2 weeks, and we also detected that B was actually rejected. And okay, so we have lots of changes here, and it's supposed to be a big impact, big redesign with lots of impact, but it wasn't so. A was kept, B didn't make it through to the implementation decision. Okay, so why is that? Why did that happen? And if we begin to kind of tag some of the kind of knowns or unknowns. What are some of for each of the changes? If we try to understand and ask ourselves the question: have we seen these kind of changes work, perform, or not in past or other experiments? Many of these changes we have no idea. Okay, so these larger photos, these kind of shifted product selections here, the shifted description. We don't know. I mean, Amazon knows different things. They probably know more, and they have other experiments and stuff. But from this point of view, these are kind of the changes that we have no idea about. Okay, so far at least. But then some of the changes we have observed to work positively in other experiments. Okay, one such change is like this increased button size. Here, okay, you might notice that these are smaller buttons, these are larger buttons, and we know that they worked before because actually Airbnb tested this in another separate leak. Okay, so they ran on March 2019, they ran a larger button experiment test. Okay, they increased the width of this button, and then fast track another couple months. This was rolled out. So we know this was an A/B test, and we know that this was implemented. Two pieces of information that are critical in stating that this has positive probability. So that has positive probability. This other change here has negative probability. 8 tiles versus 7 tiles. How do we know that? From GoodUI pattern 36, more results. 3 tests are leaning towards, so far at least, into the positive. That showing, for example, 20 versus 30 results, 30 results was better for some company. The tests are not shown here, but they're further down and available on the platform itself. And there's other changes. Price closer towards the buttons. Shifting buttons further down is potentially negative. So what's happening here is like we have some unknowns, some negatives, and some positives, all combining together. Netflix, another little experiment, or sorry, shall I say big experiment. This was detected in February also of this year, and same thing. This is the actual variant with some unknowns, logo to the left, maybe adjusted headline, but previews were removed. They were blurred out. We know that we have a pattern that shows that previews are potentially better. This was also tested by another company, and these like little indicative pricing schematics into the future and stuff like that. They also were ejected for Airbnb. Repeated calls to action. We know that they're positive and showing benefits. Additional selling points is often positive. So again, a similar situation, mixed bag of unknowns, negatives, and positives. What if we did less of these kind of mixed probabilities, and if we were able to only combine the positive probability changes together? What if we could do this? That gets us into knowns. Big experiments multiplied by probability. This is exactly the strategy we took for one of our clients here, for Kensington Tours. And there's a landing page for a travel site for planning, for generating leads for tours and for going on vacation. And yeah, we noticed that there's multiple opportunities that could be tackled in one go, starting with what everyone probably knows by now is the sticky calls to action, sticky navigation with some sort of prominent call to action that stays with you. This is a kind of a lengthier page. So that's one little change that we introduced, made this nav sticky. Why? Because this was tested 7 times already, and we have 7 experiments to show and indicate to us that there's positive probability as well as potential positive impact. Second, headline. Instead of just stating a label or what the kind of the fact that this is a tour, there's a pattern called kind of empowering headlines, which speaks the same kind of message, except makes it relative towards that kind of reader, that viewer. So explore, using verbs, you will be able to explore. You will be able to do something more than just stating the thing. Okay, it's about them. Okay, that's another change we introduced. Why? Because there's a headline pattern that we have for this that also has been tested a number of times and is into the positive, with positive effects. Okay, there's 13 changes in total that we did on this landing page, including multiple steps and exposing some of these kind of options and making them central, etc., etc., etc. And then we run an A/B test, and this generated 42% more leads. This is the actual test result. Highly ultra significant, clear separation of confidence intervals from A and B. Clear green. This was across segments. This was rerun twice with consistent effects. This was a go. Notice that this isn't just a one-off. Again, as I mentioned, we looked at 32 such projects, and I took some time and I kind of organized them into a little spreadsheet. So yeah, we do have a couple losing or low impact projects as such, but for the most part, there's a lot of green positive effects from this, with a median of 19. Okay. In summary, I mean, little experiments are still valid. They're very useful for determining the cause and effect. And if you really want to understand whether a particular isolated variable has an effect or not, then that is the way to go. That is extremely useful, and it's a valid strategic approach to running experiments. If, however, you're willing to make a trade-off and go for the biggest impact, you run bigger experiments, of course, based on probability, positive probability. Where can you find experiments? Of course, Good UI Leaks. That's something we're running right now, where every week we're adding an experiment from a prominent company. 32 so far, and new ones are being added. I also encourage you to track your own. When you run these experiments, keep them visible to your team, store them, remember them, make them searchable, create a knowledge base, take screenshots of A and B, and reuse them. What sometimes works on a particular product page, maybe it might work for another product page somewhere else on your site. And so forth. So reuse your wins and avoid your losses, or invert your losing experiments. Obviously, the internet's great for finding A/B tests. And what I showed you here is Good UI patterns. We have over 231 experiments, and new ones being at least 5 ones being added, new ones being added each month. And of course, that has the benefit of providing a more holistic picture, where patterns can compare similar experiments together and add them and try to get a bit of more of an accurate picture. Because again, we publish positive, negative, flat, significant, insignificant experiments to get a more and more accurate picture for each particular change. Okay. With this, there's a couple scenarios. Okay, big, awesome experiments look amazing. However, big experiments require also dev time, design time, dev time. Some companies we've observed can do larger experiments in hours or days. And then there's some experiments which we notice that require weeks or months for certain companies to execute on. And if that is the case, if this requires weeks or months, then realistically, filling the gaps is maybe a little bit better strategy, where we start with a slightly easier test that takes less effort, but still could be a couple of changes, but just the time towards from start to testing on day one is shorter, and you can then fill that gap. And then as that test is running, you start creating a lengthier, more effortful, test. And then, of course, this is the other reality, is as you test these larger experiments first, as you kind of exploit existing knowledge or exploit existing probabilities, you can also test, like if there's a particular change that you, again, really want to understand and know and get a sense of the kind of cause and effect out of that single change, you can definitely, separate that out, isolate that, and test that in as a separate experiment. But we can also start seeing here is typically this kind of sequence or prioritization is we start with positives, lots of positives, get into the unknowns. These are potentially ideas that we have never, these are new. We haven't observed like anyone test these. These are kind of unknown, 50-50, so to say, ideas. And then at the very end, we also have negative probability ideas. Why do we test negative probability ideas? Because if something works once or twice, yes, it's likely not going to work. It's likely going to win. We have to respect past test data, but it doesn't mean that we will, it's guaranteed to predict. The kind of, the viewpoint here is that it's probably not the best to test this first, but I think it's okay to test this last as we use up a lot of knowledge and prioritize that first. So that's kind of in a nutshell. And if you have questions, you can email me, or of course, we're adding new tests and experiments monthly. So hopefully this was useful. If you have questions, leave comments on YouTube here, and I'll try to answer. Thanks.